Hello and welcome to our 2020 MCAP Fall Webinar Series on the topic of using an equity lens for writing instruction, facilitated by our partners at San Diego County Offices of Education, Isela Jacobo and Dr. Julie Goldman. Today we present the sixth webinar of a six-part series. Please visit our website at multilingualcalifornia.org for dates of upcoming webinars and additional resources. You may also subscribe for updates and register for our next webinar, which will be on December 8th through December 10th on the topic of Universal Design for Learning and Supporting English Learners during Distance Learning. My name is Dr. Alma Castro. I'm the director of the Multilingual California Project, MCAP. MCAP is a 3-year grant awarded to CABE in March through the CDE Educator Workforce Investment Grant. The goals of the MCAP grant are to provide professional learning opportunities for teachers, administrators, and paraprofessionals across the state for implementing the English Learner Roadmap policy. The MCAP Alliance includes CABE and 5 strong county offices of education, including Butte, Fresno, San Bernardino, Orange, San Diego, and San Diego State University. The MCAP builds on a robust body of research highlighting multilingualism as the most effective option for the academic achievement of English language learners across the content areas and for their preparation to participate effectively in the global workforce. As we get ready for today's exciting session, I have a few housekeeping matters to share. As this is a webinar, the speaker's microphones will be active and the participants' microphones will be on mute. If you would like to pose a question during the presentation, please use the chat icon on the Zoom control menu. You may type your comments and questions, and we may have time to get to the questions after the webinar. After the webinar, we will also post the recording of this presentation and resources on the Multilingual California website so that you may access today's information and also share it with others. We will also invite you at the end of today's presentation to please help us by completing the survey that will be provided in your chat box. Please sit back, relax, and get ready for 45 minutes of powerful online engagement and learning. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome our colleagues, Isela Jacobo and Dr. Julie Goldman from San Diego County Offices of Education, who will be our presenters for today. Welcome, colleagues.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today's session is using an equity lens for K-12 writing instruction, and I have the pleasure of being the co-presenter to a wonderful, wonderful researcher, curriculum developer, mentor, Dr. Julie Goldman, and I would like for her to introduce herself. Julie?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here, and we look forward to sharing the next 45 minutes together.
So again, I have the fortune of co-presenting with Dr. Julie Goldman today. My name is Isela Jacobo, and I am one of the coordinators at the SDCOE Multilingual Education and Global Achievement Office. Aside from that title, I also have the privilege of being the grant lead for MCAP. So I'm so excited to be here with you sharing about the right instruction today. So we would like to begin our session by asking you to please take a few minutes to think about a positive experience you've had around writing or writing instruction. And if I'm correct, I believe that we've created a poll for this. Alexandria, if you don't mind sharing the poll with our participants now. So let's take a couple seconds, colleagues, to write or choose. So a positive experience around writing or writing instruction that you had. And as you continue to respond to our poll, I want to say that the answers that you see listed here are the most common answers we get when we ask these questions to groups of educators around the nation. So we'll take a couple more seconds. And Alexandra, are we ready to share the results? Great. So colleagues, we see that the positive experience that most people have selected is writing a note or card to someone that has made a difference in their lives. Beautiful. We see that the next most popular selection was, there's a tie. So documented growth in a student's writing and language proficiency as a result of your instruction. And we also had collaborated with a colleague on writing. Beautiful. I'm glad to hear, colleagues, that you've had so many wonderful experiences with writing. I can share from a personal note that as an English learner who arrived in the United States when I was 16, my experiences in general were very poor and not ones that I like to share. So I'm glad to see that there's colleagues in our field who've had positive experience that they can in turn share with their students. And it's because of students like myself who've had very poor experiences with writing as English learners that we have opportunities like the Write Institute. If we can move on to the next slide. We want to share with you that WRITE stands for Writing Redesigned for Innovative Teaching and Equity. And WRITE is definitely a very innovative approach to integrated literacy instruction for K-12. As we move on to the next slide, I'd like to share with you that in 1990, through Title VII, our county office was awarded with a grant that allowed for the WRITE project to be born. And over the last 30 years, this project has been one that has reached so many teachers and students throughout our nation. And it's due to people like Dr. Goldman that this project and work continues to evolve and extend around many states. So since then, WRITE has also been awarded or included in at least 12 large-scale grants. So we're very proud of the work that Dr. Goldman and other team members have produced over the years. As we move on to the next slide, I'd like to just take a couple seconds to reflect on the next quote from David Conley. And it's through work like this and quotes like this that we know that if there's one thing that we can do different when attending to writing instruction for our English learners is definitely looking at increasing the time, increasing the opportunities that we're providing for our English learners, and looking at the quality of our writing instruction. Moving on to the next slide. We want to make sure that as we engage in this next 40 minutes that we have together, we all remind ourselves that we are leaders for equity, that our responsibility as educators is to lead for equity. And leading for equity means that we all take responsibility for what matters to us, as in the words of Julian Weisglass. So it is critical that as we engage in the work we're doing with all students, but particularly with our English learners, we use that equity lens as we move on to the next slide, always recognizing and identifying, being very grounded on our why. So as we conduct, as we go about doing this work over the next 40 minutes, it is critical that we connect to our equity why, that we take a moment to reflect on our identity, our experiences, our role, and we think about what is our equity why. As educators, we are designers, and as we design programs and instruction, our equity why is what guides our work and provides clarity in the work that we're doing. So throughout this session today, colleagues, you will have multiple opportunities to reflect on your equity why. We ask that as you're engaged in this work, you ask yourself questions such as what is my identity in relationship to my students? How am I showing up? How are people perceiving me? How are people receiving me? So let's move on to the next slide. And allow me to just share with you that this work that we do through Write requires a very clear and explicit equity lens. We need to make sure that we understand that when we engage with this work, Write is definitely taking a new and very different approach to English learner writing. It's not writing as it's been taught, is definitely taking a very close look at our practices through this equity lens. And we want to reassure you that Write continues to evolve as new research becomes available. As we move on to the next slide, it is critical that as we engage with Write, we understand clearly the difference between equality and equity. So we know and recognize that equality means giving everyone the same resources. And we've done that in our system, unfortunately, too many times and too often. We know that for us to be able to move forward and lift our English learner students and families, equity is required. And equity is basically providing our students with the resources they need, given the needs that we've identified. So ensuring that we remove barriers from their way to success. So each child receiving what he or she needs to develop to his or her full academic and social potential. And we do this work, as we move on to the next slide, through learning partnership bridges. And this is a metaphor that we like to use and Write that basically calls for us to look very closely through our equity lens at what we know, what we need to learn as educators, what we need to address about ourselves and the students and families we serve. And that is that learning partnership bridge that needs to exist for us to be able to teach writing to our English learners through that equity lens that we're talking about. So I like for us to stop here for a couple seconds and have you reflect on how might we bridge the two ways of looking to inform our writing instruction. So recognizing that those two ways are looking in, so insights to myself, and looking out, so looking at our students, our families, our communities, our colleagues. How do we bridge those two ways of looking to inform the designs that we're creating to teach writing to our English learners? So let's take a couple seconds to reflect on that. As we move on to the next slide. So it is critical that as we engage in this reflection and we start thinking about how to build this bridge between us, our identity, and the identity of our students, our families, and our communities, that we look at three key domains that influence student learning. So it's not only the identity, but it's also the mindset and the skills. And there's very key questions that we need to be asking ourselves as we're engaging in this work. So I would like for us to take some time to look at this particular slide and the questions that we need to be engaging with as we're designing instruction for our English language learners, again, through that equity lens. So the work that we're doing through this learning partnership bridges require that for identity purposes, as we build those bridges, we ask, what do I understand about my own identity and how my students experience me? It is critical that for this work, we also ask ourselves to build that mindset bridge. What are my assumptions about my students' abilities to succeed as writers? And for the skills bridge that we're asking ourselves, what skills do I need to provide students with dynamic writing instruction? What skills do they need? So as we're engaging in this reflection, I'd like for us to move on to the next slide. and just point out that one of the core beliefs of the right project, the right approach, is that we need to be leading from the inside out. All meaningful and lasting change begins on the inside, as Dr. Martin Luther King so beautifully expressed. So Wright believes that teachers need to be provided with opportunities to examine and explore their own identities, their own biases, and to explore their own skill set and continue to further that to create that lasting change that is so needed in our classrooms. And we recognize, as we move on to the next slide, that any system is set to produce what it was designed to produce. So what we're going to be introducing you to today is the approach that Wright follows in order to change the system, and that experience that our English learners are currently, again, unfortunately experiencing in many classrooms. In Wright, as we move on to the next slide, we also recognize that to do this work, we need to build a shared understanding of what quality instruction is. And that shared understanding, it's not only with us and our colleagues, but it's also across the district and across the state, across the nation. We need to have a common vision so change can truly happen. We'd like to share with you the next quote from Leading for Instructional Improvement. So without a shared understanding of what we mean by quality instruction, we have no basis from which to mount an improvement effort. So Wright recognizes that and addresses that. And as we move on to the next slide, I want to point out before I hand this over to Dr. Goldman that through Wright, we approach academic literacy, recognizing that reading and writing are integrated language strands that heavily rely on that development of oracy. So we know that oracy is the springboard to writing, and that for instruction to make sense to our students, we need to ensure that we're integrating those opportunities for our students to learn and develop their reading, their writing, and their oracy skills. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to my friend, Dr. Goldman.
Thank you, Isela, and we'll go to the next slide, and we're going to take a deeper dive now into, an overview of what the right approach looks like. So on the next slide, we looked at the research on writing and integrating writing, as Isela talked about, really that interplay of reading, writing, and academic language that's all happening simultaneously. And from an expansive review of the research, it really came down to these instructional practices. So just as we started out today with a positive, we also want to start with your strength. So looking at these practices, which one would you say is your strength? We'll take a couple more minutes. So we all have different strengths, and this is a place to really start this process, is looking at what am I already doing well in my instructional practice, and what do I have to build on, and what can I share with my colleagues? If I'm really great at building on students' backgrounds, how can we leverage some of my expertise and tap into the expertise of our colleagues? So I think most people have probably, we can go ahead and share results. Great, wonderful. And so this is really great news here that number 3, model writing for and with students, is the lead choice here, because truly, if there is one thing that you would want to walk away from these 45 minutes doing differently, it is absolutely, the research shows, is that modeling writing, modeling the deconstruction of language and reconstruction. And This is very good. The grammar and vocabulary, teaching that explicitly, we often see that. There is a huge connection between oracy and the reading and writing, so we would want to build on that, but this gives us really important information. So we'll go to the next slide. Thank you for participating in the poll. And so this is an overview of what this is, a unit of instruction, a unit design. And we bolded on the previous slide, teaching genre as a process, because all of the rest of the practices are nested within that first practice. So if we're looking at traditional instruction, especially as we move up in the grades, we tend to see assigning writing and not teaching writing. So maybe we'll do some kind of teaching around the drafting and some revising on those two blue squares at the bottom, but that blue line at the top, that amplified pre-writing process, which is really where we want to spend the majority of our instructional time, this is where the magic happens. And when we spend that time in the pre-writing process, then by the time students get to the drafting phase, they already know about that genre. So just to walk through it very briefly here, we would start with a pre-assessment. If it's summary writing, it would be a short reading and the rubric, and they would summarize the reading. And whatever you do for your pre-assessment, you're going to want to do for that formative, we call it a post-assessment, but it's really a formative midway through process. And then we go through introducing the genre, the criteria, using an analytic rubric, which we'll talk about in just a few slides, building on our students' backgrounds, which we're doing all throughout the whole process, but we really intentionally want to make sure to connect to prior learning there. And then we go into the modeling phase, which again, we'll spiral back to. And that collaborating phase, that is where we'll spend, again, out of all of these 6 areas, we will spend the majority of the time in the collaborating writing phase. And that is where the oracy and the vocabulary and grammar and all of that comes together in that reading, writing, and speaking. And once students have experienced the genre with their teachers, with their peers multiple times, by the time you get to that drafting phase and they are experiencing the genre on their own, they know it well. And then we take it all the way to final publishing. So we can go to the next slide. So you might think, where do I start? Where do I even start this whole process? Well, we start with the end in mind. What do I want my students to know and be able to do at the end of the unit? What kinds of experiences? If it's problem solution writing, am I going to write a problem solution letter? What's the genre? What kind of experiences do I want to connect kids with schools through global learning networks? How much time do I have practically for this? And what kind of text, meaning artwork, do I want them to interact with? Obviously written text, but also videos and other opportunities. So on the next slide, we group our genres we align them to the text types. So we have our informative, explanatory, argumentative, and narrative, but we focus on genre families within these text types, which breaking it down into the simpler component parts and then building them back up. Because for an informative, explanatory piece of writing, we're going to be using compare contrast, problem solution writing, cause effect, which we actually have within our problem solution unit, research. All of this language is ultimately blended, but we want to teach it as a discrete skill and practice it so that we get familiar with the language, such as we'll see on the next slide here. And looking at those language functions. So when we focus on genres, we can learn the language around describing or persuading or proposing, reasoning, reporting, sequencing, and so forth. So another point on the next slide is to keep writing portfolios, either digitally or if when we're back in person, or a hybrid of both. The research really supports either way is excellent, but there's a lot of support for keeping writing portfolios. And in recent contexts, we've been working with groups of teachers that, haven't previously been keeping writing portfolios. So that was one item that we wanted to share with you today, is that is something you can turn around and start tomorrow. You see that growth in language over time. Students are able to set goals and self-evaluate, and they get to see their own creativity and growth in writing. Go to the next slide. So starting this process, as I mentioned before, we want to start with that baseline assessment, because in this way we can use writing to inform our own instruction and use an analytic rubric to do so. And by analytic, on the next slide, we mean criterion based, like very specific, like the introduction identifies the author, the title, the main idea. It's very specific. It's not a nebulous idea. And of course, keeping in mind that assessment is really doing this pre-assessment informs our own instruction, because once I know, wow, all of my students did really well on one criterion, but everybody struggled on another. And so I'll know going into that unit that I really need to focus on certain specific areas. Next slide. So this is an example. We do have different, we have a 4-point rubric for elementary grades and a 6-point to show smaller increments of growth in a secondary context. So this is an elementary example on a 4-point rubric. And, this is a 6-point rubric. So we see how the students did very well in showing on a compare contrast piece of writing how the subjects were different, and yet they struggled a little bit more in the pre-assessment with how they're alike. So I can use that data to guide my own instructional practice and decide to focus more time on comparing sentence frames. Next slide. So think about a time that you learned something through modeling. Now, clearly this was your number one, which I can tell you when we do this with groups, that is not always the case. So just think about a time that you've learned anything through modeling. You've got some prompts on there. Maybe you learned to tie your shoe or dance or cook, or really nowadays with our teenagers, it's all, they just pull up YouTube, and maybe a few people could put some driving, great, and the Zumba exercise, wonderful, changing a tire, great. So the same thing, the same approach goes for teaching writing. When we get to see it modeled and observe our peers, how to cook a turkey, good one. This is very beneficial to our own practice. So next slide. We love this quote by Kelly Gallagher that I don't tell them how to draft their papers. I show them how I draft my papers. So this is kind of the thinking behind that practice, modeling writing for and with students. Next slide. You can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So here we are. We've kind of talked about building on our backgrounds, the whole process itself. The instructional process is teaching genre as a process. And now we're focused on that top right-hand square, the collaborate. It's time to collaborate, where we're reading, writing, and speaking, and not writing as an afterthought. It's all happening together. It's happening simultaneously. And this is where those other next two practices come into play, developing oral language and vocabulary. Next slide. So one example would be, taking the who, what, where, why, when, and how, and showing students how we can vary syntax. This is so important with our English learners, but truly it helps students, across grades and for both integrated and designated ELD contacts. And you can see in the right-hand photo there that the punctuation is embedded in that sentence strip, and students get to play with language. Maybe they'll start with the who or the when or the what, and we play with language, and they get to vary their syntax and see how we can make different gist summary statements. Next slide. Another go-to type of activity that we use are summary posters. So we're taking it out of the reading into a non-linguistic representation. Maybe we have, in this, we're talking about the instructional practice here. If we were reading about our instructional practices, but you could have the title of the article or the video that you're watching. What are some of the key points? If it were a drawing or an icon, what are connections that you see to your learning or previous units? And the golden line is one sentence or phrase that is verbatim from the reading. Next slide. Another example would be that idea of patterning. For English learners, this is very important. And then we have many, many different types of patterns. So we can see as we pattern, we can expand our repertoire. So in the short story or in the novel, in the article, the author shows, tells, explores, explains, and then that main idea from the gist summary sentence. Other types of activities include, reciprocal teaching and all of these great resources that we talk about in the ELA, ELD framework and Socratic seminars and different activities such as that, but really adding the language components to those. Next slide. For example, with language frames, there are just countless ways. In just the secondary alone, I think we share like a 20-page document of all these different language frames that we wouldn't share with the students, but we start to layer it into our instruction in each genre so that students become familiar with more ways of expressing themselves. Next slide. And when we're talking about the grammar and vocabulary, we also look at what does the research say? What are the one or two or three things that the research really says to focus on? And so we know it's that high frequency grammar. It's connecting it to our own reading and writing, not having like an outside grammar book, and using non-textbook grammar sources, having grammar done on, on the walls and more in context type of grammar. Next slide. So this is a quote that we like from one of the West Ed researchers that we worked with during the IES study a few years ago. And they talked about this approach, that when teachers experience this approach, it's this type of learning is how they engage in deep change. And that deep change that Isela was talking about at the beginning, of looking at our identities. Who am I? How am I showing up with my students? what is my mindset? What are my beliefs about my students' ability to succeed as writers? And what is my skill set? And what we learned from that, one of the things that we learned in that study was, the need to focus on our implicit biases with our students, and also on our skill set, and of course explore our own identities. Next slide. So in a Write classroom, you will see lots of writing and student writing on the walls, just covering walls. And in a pandemic context, we'll see that across Google Docs, and still that sharing when students show up, there's lots of writing to share. Next slide. So we like to bring the conversation back to, once I know what I need to be doing differently. And again, in this group, we're doing a lot right with starting with that modeling writing for and with our students. So what do I need to stop doing? What do I need to continue doing in my practice? And what do I need to start doing? So we like to leave you with those questions to ponder. Next slide. And we truly believe that writing, when Isela showed you the slide earlier on, that if there's one thing that will make the biggest impact for students to succeed in college and career, it's increasing the amount and the quality of writing that they're expected to produce. And this is a social justice issue to focus on. Next slide. So we'd like to open it up to, do we have time for a few questions?
Thank you, Dr. Goldman. Yes, we have a couple of minutes, and I do see one question that was posted on our chat is in thinking about how this would translate to grades K or first grade, what falls into the ELA and what's in the realm of ELD.
Great question. So this approach is used both in designated and integrated EL contexts, language contexts, and we have resources K-12 and currently developing pre-K. So the grade spans are pre-K, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8, and 9, 12. As far as, I mean, to answer the question, like what falls in designated and integrated, that would be a much meatier question, but it is used in both contexts, the approaches.
So here's another question. Is there any access online for out-of-state teachers to learn more about the Write resource?
Absolutely. You can email Isela or me, either one of us, and at the end of the presentation. And we hold classes. We're both teaching a couple of classes right now that are across the state. In the past, we have worked with teachers in Nevada, Oregon, Washington State. So absolutely. We are aligned to the writing standards for California, but they're very, very similar to the national standards.
I do see another question. Are those classes available online, and can presenters please share their emails on the chat? And at this point, Dr. Goldman and Isela, anything else you'd like to share before we go into our closing would be wonderful. Any other resources or any other tips would be wonderful.
I think that there was a resource, Alexander, that we had to share, just kind of synthesizing. It's a Focus on English Learner, that resource that synthesizes this approach that we will share with you. And we are currently piloting a 10-week course. So historically, we have led professional learning like 2 days and then with follow-up meetings quarterly. And during the pandemic, we started teaching a 10-week course. We started with the secondary, and in February, we'll be launching the elementary K-5. So if you're interested in either one of those courses, the 10-week courses, let us know and we will help you get registered.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And I'm adding our email address to the chat box. So you should now have mine and Dr. Goldman's. I do have to share for those colleagues who are currently teaching in bilingual dual language settings that our goal, very ambitious goal, is to be able to produce all this in Spanish for your use. And again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Isela, and thank you, Dr. Goldman. We really appreciate you sharing such great strategies today, ideas, tools, and resources for having an equity lens and supporting English language learners in writing. We invite you to share in our chat box any suggestions of other types of professional learning that you would like to see in the future. Please be sure to complete today's participant survey. This is one of the requirements for our grant, and it allows us to continue to provide free professional learning opportunities via MCAP. We also invite you to participate in our next webinar series, which will be presented by our partners at San Bernardino Superintendent of Schools. You may register now via our MCAP website at multilingualcalifornia.org. The link will be placed in the chat box. The link to the survey will also be placed in the chat box. We invite you to follow us also on social media. Our handles will be placed in our chat box as well. And please feel free to share information through social media. On behalf of our Multilingual California Alliance, we hope you and your families continue to stay safe managing the circumstances due to COVID-19. We are thankful that you are here with us today and invite you to our future webinars presented by our MCAP team. Once again, we extend our gratitude to Isela Jacobo and Dr. Julie Goldman from San Diego County Offices of Education. Thank you, educators, for being with us this evening.